Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this ICAS webinar on a topic that's not only crucial, but also deeply relevant in today's evolving professional landscape, advancing social mobility and accountancy. I'm honoured to be your host for this informative session. My name is Sanjay Singh, the director of the ICAS Foundation. ICAS is social mobility charity. At the ICAS Foundation, we are deeply committed to promoting access to the accountancy profession for talented individuals from all backgrounds, irrespective of their socio-economic status. The Foundation celebrates its 10th anniversary this year, and in that time, we have positively affected the lives of over 300 young people whose dream it has been to progress onto university from school or college. We have awarded bursaries of over £2.3 million to support them with their cost of living and education. 100% of our students come from lower socio-economic backgrounds and are ambitious and driven to pursue a career in the accountancy profession. Just shy of 70% go on to successfully secure a training contract to become a chartered accountant. In fact, we now have newly qualified CAs who have been through the ICAS Foundation programme, now volunteering with us as mentors, supporting those aspiring young people to achieve their dream. In the world of finance and accounting, social mobility remains an essential, yet at times overlooked aspect. Today, we'll delve into the dynamics, challenges and opportunities surrounding social mobility generally within the workforce, and the accountancy profession, aiming to shed light on ways to foster a better understanding of the topic. Now, if there's one thing I'd ask you to do after this webinar, is to visit our website, icasfoundation.org.uk, and consider supporting our work and join other CAs in improving social mobility into the profession. Now, before I introduce you to our speakers, just some housekeeping to cover. Near the end of this webinar, there may be time for some Q&As for our speakers, so please do feel free to type your questions anytime through the Q&A facility, which can be accessed at the top of your screen, and I'll do my best to address those at the end. You can also comment via the chat function. We are recording this webinar and will make it available on demand for viewing afterwards in case you want to refer back to it or share it with others. The slides will be available on the events page on the ICAS website under the event listing, and everyone on the webinar is automatically muted, so there is no need to be concerned about background noise wherever you are. Now, we have a distinguished panel of speakers, each bringing a unique perspective and a wealth of experience to the discussion. So allow me to introduce them. ICAS President Clive Bellingham, CA, is a former member of the PwC Global Board and former partner. He retired from his role at PwC in 2021, where he worked in Scotland, Saudi Arabia and Switzerland, where he now resides. As a member of PwC's Global Board for 8 years, Clive contributed to the governance and oversight of a network covering more than 150 countries. He chaired the Clients and Markets Committee for 4 years and retains a position on the PwC India Advisory Board. As ICAS's first international president, Clive has focused his presidency on driving sustainability reporting and assurance agenda, audit reform, and championing wider access to the accountancy profession from outside traditional routes to entry. Nick Miller is Chief Executive of the Bridge Group, with overall responsibility for strategy, fundraising and compliance. He has also led many of the charity's research programmes and is involved directly with commission projects, mainly with employers. Nick has particular expertise in quantitative research methods and in translating research findings into practical policy recommendations. Nick's recent clients include the BBC, the Cabinet Office and Linklaters. He has also advised the government on equality, diversity and inclusion, and often plays a leading role in presenting Bridge Group findings to audiences across sectors. He has also published on these topics, most recently in The Class Ceiling and in Access to Success and Social Mobility Through Higher Education. Nick is also a partner at More Partnership, a trustee of the Unite Foundation, and is a research associate and fellow at the University of York. Paula Kemp is the Head of Employer Engagement for the Social Mobility Commission. The Social Mobility Commission exists to see a UK where the circumstances of one's birth do not determine outcomes in life. Paula, in her role as Head of Employer Engagement, works with employers across multiple sectors to create more inclusive and diverse socio-economic workforces. She joined the Commission from Santander, where she was Diversity and Inclusion Manager, leading their participation in the research Who Gets Ahead and How, which resulted in the task force to improve socio-economic diversity at senior levels in financial and professional services. She is also an advisory board member on UCL's research into inequalities in access to elite occupations. And finally, a slight change to our final speaker, who is Jenny, is Mark Russell. Now, Mark is a manager in the Inclusion, Diversity and Equity team at KPMG UK. He works collaboratively across the organisation to ensure that IDE is embedded throughout all policies, processes and systems that impact the employee lifecycle. Mark has worked in the team for 7 years and has led on firm-wide initiatives and activity, including thought leadership, benchmarks, advocacy policies, events and campaigns. He has worked across all characteristics within the IDE landscape and brings his passion and desire for fairness, accessibility and inclusion to everything he does. He leads on their work to embed social mobility as a core part of the IDE agenda for their 17,000 colleagues. Throughout this webinar, our speakers will share their perspectives, experiences and insight for driving positive change in promoting social mobility. So without further ado, let's dive into our presentations. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Clive, to share their insights on this crucial topic. Clive, please share with us why social mobility is important to ICAS, and as President, why this has been important to you.
Thanks very much, Sanjay. Delighted to join you this morning. Look, the CAs play an important role in all aspects of finance, business, and society. And there's a market-driven demand for more talent in the accounting profession. And this is in large part due to new requirements for sustainability reporting. We as chartered accountants have been very familiar with financial reporting, and we're well placed to support the increasing need for sustainability reporting and assurance. And that's creating a demand for talent that we're attempting to match. Also at ICAS, we remain very focused on ED&I in our student population and our membership. And we're really keen to raise awareness of the accounting profession, particularly in schools, and then provide pathways that support access through different routes. And I think about my own experience when I was at Kirkcaldy High School and my careers teacher said to me, well, you're good at maths, you're good at physics, go and study it at Edinburgh University. Now, that wasn't really careers advice. And I frankly failed my first year at Edinburgh University and was then fortunate to sort of drift into accounting and do an HND, and the rest is history, so to speak. But the key thing there is that we need to really raise awareness of the profession in the schools, because it provides that level of awareness to a much broader community. And then we at ICAS have and will continue to work on different pathways that enable people to become chartered accountants, either directly from school, through colleges, or through universities. So it's really about sort of casting the net much wider, but we need the educational establishments to support us in making people aware of the opportunities that the accounting profession offers, and particularly the CA, which is, in essence, very much a business qualification. And I think lastly, the key thing I would say is, really, why would you limit yourself in terms of access to talent? I mean, we're all looking for talent. And so, again, we need to spread this net widely. And in my experience of, having worked particularly globally, diverse and inclusive teams add tremendous value to organizations, the clients they serve, and society more broadly. So I will continue to be a very strong advocate for social mobility, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be at this presentation. Back to you, Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Clive, and thank you for being so honest about your own personal journey as well. And I think we all agree about our drive to promote diverse and inclusive teams. Now, moving on to Nick Miller. Nick, can you introduce us to social mobility and what the Bridge Group data is telling us about the accountancy profession?
Fantastic. Thank you, Sanjay, and thanks for the opportunity to share a bit of time with you and your colleagues this morning. It's been really energizing to hear about the work of the foundation. And Clive, thanks for your opening. You've set the stage for me perfectly. For those of you who are less familiar, the Bridge Group is a charity. We've been around for just over a decade now, focusing on diversity and inclusion with a very precise focus on socioeconomic background. That work has happily involved working very closely with the Social Mobility Commission, so I'll be delighted to hand over to Paula, and also with Mark and colleagues at KPMG. A really important pillar of our work during that 10 years has been Access Accountancy, which is a consortium, for those of you who don't know, a consortium of accountancy firms through which we've received about 85 million data points over the last 8 years on access to the accounting profession, who gets ahead and how and who is retained. So wish me luck as I attempt to summarize those 85 million data points over the next 12 minutes. And just to echo Sanjay's earlier sentiment, we'll share the deck with colleagues on the call as well. Afterwards, there are quite a few data illustrations that I'll be sharing as we go through this together. Here are 4 key points, though, that I wanted to open with. We know a lot more today in 2024 than we did even 2 or 3 years ago about the effects of socioeconomic background on who accesses the accountancy profession, and as I described earlier, who then gets ahead and how. It's also important to note that there are 2 sectors in which we have the richest evidence. Those 2 sectors are accountancy and law. In the latter sector, of course, the regulator mandates the collection of socioeconomic background data and the publishing of it. We currently also, as a bit of a footnote, have the regulator in financial services, the Financial Conduct Authority, shortly due to report back on a consultation about whether financial services firms should also be regulated to collect employee data on socioeconomic background as well. But for the purposes of this morning, the data set we have in accountancy is remarkably rich. And when we talk about data at the Bridge Group, we mean both quantitative data, which will be my focus for this morning, but also qualitative data. Obviously, the quant data shows us what's happening, but it doesn't tell us much about the factors that contribute to what's happening, nor what we should do in response to it. To my second point on this opening slide, we found in a lot of our work handling data in the accountancy profession, but also in adjacent professions like the law and financial services, that socioeconomic background has a stronger effect on accessing the profession, a stronger effect on pay gaps and on who gets ahead, compared with protected characteristics like gender or ethnicity. Now, I should say very quickly, that's not to suggest we should sort of play diversity top trumps, that one characteristic is more important than the other. But we do know from our data that if you're a firm that wants to access that more diverse talent, as Clive was describing, and you don't focus on socioeconomic background, you miss a really important part of the jigsaw. We also know, of course, that socioeconomic background has really important relationships with other diversity characteristics as well. And there's not time here this morning to explore it in too much detail, but in our work, we focus a lot on how socioeconomic background affects females and males differently, and also importantly, how socioeconomic background intersects with ethnicity as well. And then finally on this slide, just to land these key points, and this builds on what Clive was sharing. We also know that even if one doesn't want to engage with the sort of moral argument for greater equity in the workplace, there is an increasingly strong business case for investing in this area. And I can share various references with the slides if that's helpful. At the Bridge Group, our work on performance has been particularly illuminating in the legal sector, where working with the UK's 12 largest law firms, we showed that amongst trainees, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were much more likely, 75% more likely, to be in the top decile of performers. So the headline there is that on average, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds outperform their colleagues from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So in the legal sector, as was reported on the front page of the newspaper, in the legal sector, the business case is one. So I'm going to talk you through 5 slides now, starting to look at socioeconomic background representation overall in the accountancy sector, and then unpicking some of the factors that contribute to it. So I'll just bring up the next slide and just take a glass of water while you digest that. Okay, so this slide is showing us across these, different sectors, the proportion of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And you can see in the legend there on the right that the blue bar, the bottom bar, is the proportion of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. This data uses the parental occupation metric to identify people's socioeconomic background. If you're coming to this topic relatively fresh, you probably will be interested in this question of how we measure someone's socioeconomic background. And there's lots of debate and research on this topic. But the headline really is to say this question around what your main household earner did as an occupation at age 14 is the strongest metric we can use here. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is, I'm sorry to say, that link between the occupation of your main household earner at age 14 and your adult outcomes is stronger here in the UK compared with almost any other developed country. That is to say, this particular metric is a really strong predictor for the types of opportunities you have access to as you go through your education and working life. Importantly, too, the question on parental occupation is also relevant for employees who were educated outside of the UK. And it's also the metrics that's used in the Labour Force Survey, which is published quarterly, and in the National Census. So you can see, looking at this chart here, the bars on the right with LFS in brackets there is referring to the Labour Force Survey data with Accountancy on the right. And then as you move towards the left, we can also look at, for example, the university population. And that's the proportion of students currently studying in our higher education system that are from these backgrounds. And then the 2 bars on the left, the AA there, relates to access accountancy. So we're looking here at the diversity of applicants to these 32 accountancy firms in the UK that submit data to us every year. That includes the largest accountancy firms in the UK. And if I just reflect briefly, this data looks very different by geography. So if we think about the accountancy profession, the diversity by socioeconomic background increases dramatically when we look outside London and Greater London. And it also varies greatly by practice area too. So typically when we're looking at accountancy firms, those in audit, for example, and tax are typically much more diverse by socioeconomic background compared with those working in advisory or on mergers and acquisitions. And I'll return to why that might be in a second. But ultimately, these overall levels of diversity in the accountancy sector are a construct of 4 things. 1, who is hired at junior levels, post-school or post-university. Secondly, who is retained, who sticks around. Thirdly, who progresses most quickly, who's promoted and at what rate. And then fourthly, who is hired externally. And I'm going to talk, Sanjay, briefly to each of those areas before I pass over to Paula. So again, to emphasize, we have really rich data on the applicants to the accountancy sector. The next slide is going to show us the trends in the diversity of the applicant population amongst these 32 accountancy firms from 2016 up to the latest year of analysis. And again, there's quite a lot of data on this slide. So you can see this data includes looking at gender. So we see there the proportion of applicants who are female, the proportion of applicants from a state school background, and also, and I want to draw your eye to the bottom line there, the proportion of applicants who are from backgrounds where they've received income support or free school meals, which here is a proxy for socioeconomic background. So we can see that encouragingly, the applicants to these accountancy firms are becoming more diverse. So we now know that 1 in 5 applicants, 20%, is from this lower socioeconomic background. So that should really encourage us that the diversity of applicants is becoming more diverse. However, I guess we're most interested in who gets in, because in principle, a more diverse applicant group might not necessarily be a positive thing if it continues to be the case that certain candidates are much more likely to be successful compared with others. In this next slide, just briefly, we look at the overall success rate of applicants. So you see this swing. Again, this goes across a similar time frame, and this is the overall offer rate amongst applicants to these accountancy firms. So we see this swing when the pandemic really kicked in. So the proportion of applicants being successful was quite low, around the 3% mark. And as we get to the latest data, we're seeing the proportion of applicants offered places is not dissimilar to sort of pre-pandemic levels at 6%. But what we're most interested in is who is successful relative to others. And this next chart just shows us the difference in success rates amongst different groups. So the way that we express that is through a sort of a percentage. It's using odds ratios. So an equal success rate would say, for example, around gender, that females are 0% more likely to be successful compared with males. So here's some of that data and how it's changed over time. And again, this data looks at gender, school type, those who are on free school meals, and also ethnicity. So for example, if you look at the top bar there, that's showing us that applicants from white backgrounds as an ethnic group are much more likely to be successful compared with other ethnic groups, so Black, Asian and minority ethnic populations. They're 63% more likely to be successful, those people from a white background. Quick footnote, in our work, we try to avoid wherever possible grouping ethnicities into that BAME category, but the data gets small sometimes, and so we've needed to do that in this particular data set. But the most important bar here is the different success rates in that middle orange bar between those who are on free school meals and those who are not. So that's showing us how much more or less likely those who are not on free school meals, so the more advantaged group, how much more likely they are to be successful. And again, we saw this peak during the pandemic when there were fewer people being hired and perhaps less appetite around risk. So we saw there that more advantaged groups were much more likely to be successful, and that's returning down to that more equal success rate in the latest data set. So here we're beginning to understand who gets in. You're much more likely to be successful if you're from a higher socioeconomic background. And then two final data illustrations to show you. We've then begun to look at who progresses most quickly within firms. And here we talk about the progression gap. So what's the difference between the speed at which someone progresses from a lower socioeconomic background compared to a higher? That's in the data here, and I think Mark at KPMG might talk to some of the KPMG data as well here. So this is looking at progression rates into middle management in these accountancy firms, and then that next step to senior leadership, i.e. from director to partner. So here we're looking at the different rates at which people progress from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So to draw your eye to the right-hand chart, that's showing us that on average, it takes those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds 16% longer to progress to partner compared with those from a higher socioeconomic background. And then the sort of final piece of this jigsaw is what effect does sort of lateral hiring have, that appointment of people from outside a firm compared with those who are progressing. And the headline here is that amongst these accountancy firms, lateral hiring is working against diversity rather than for it. So the diversity of people progressing up through a firm into senior roles is more diverse than the population being recruited from external organisations. And here's that data just briefly before I wrap up. So here we're looking at how lateral hires, so people hired from outside a firm, compare with non-lateral hires, people who have progressed within the firm. And we see here in two key areas around gender, for example, that group coming in from externally are less diverse compared with those who progress internally. That population is more likely to be male. Similarly, around socioeconomic background, we look at school type here. The incoming group appointed externally is more likely to be from an independent school compared with those progressing up. And I think this is an area which is emerging as an important point of focus for those looking at socioeconomic background diversity. What are the effects of people being recruited externally? And I know many of the search agencies and headhunters are now getting more in tune with needing to focus on this aspect of diversity. And then final two slides before I hand over to Paula. We, of course, alongside all of this data analysis, have undertaken thousands of interviews across sectors to begin to understand the factors that contribute to these unequal access rates and progression rates. And here are some of the key things that stand out from our research. We know from our interviews that importantly, many of the factors that contribute to people getting ahead at work, on the one hand, are relatively unrelated to job performance, and on the other hand, are much more available to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So that would include things like accessing alumni, family and social networks. Lots of people talk about confidence and gravitas at work, and those things tend to be more easily expressed by those who feel comfortable in the dominant culture. People talk to us a lot about the way in which clients, of course, help set the sort of culture at work as much as your colleagues do. And we know that while clients of accountancy firms have begun to look, or have now for a while looked very seriously at diversity by ethnic background and by gender, they haven't yet really matured into looking properly at how teams might be diverse by socioeconomic background. These last couple of points here, the penultimate one, we've labelled career self-sorting, and that is the way in which people actively sort themselves into particular areas of the profession. So we see that most illuminated when we look at advisory practices in accountancy firms, where people tend to self-sort themselves out of that area if they're from a lower socioeconomic background. And then finally, we've looked a lot at sponsored mobility, the extent to which senior people, for want of a better phrase, adopt junior colleagues and help lift them up through an organisation. And there's a wider point here too about team leaders and the way in which they and professional services firms need the time and the toolkit to be really effective, inclusive leaders. And to put that rather more bluntly, of course, it's not the case that if you're a really effective auditor, you're by virtue of that a really effective team leader. Those two things are quite different skills. And then finally, and I'm going to be very brief because I know Paul is going to talk through some of these things, but we've done a lot of work because this is what we care most about, on what has a positive impact in this area. And I'll talk to two just very briefly. One is that I was a sort of target skeptic, I confess, historically, but actually we've observed that setting targets is a really important discipline for modelling and understanding the data. And then this last point on the slide, which in one sense feels very sort of abstract, but it's deeply important. Lots of firms that we work with, the way that you achieve greater diversity and inclusion often is about having a laser-like focus on what matters in the role and having a greater level of specificity about talent, what people need and what doesn't matter quite as much. Because ultimately, diversity and inclusion done well puts the best person in the job. Thanks for your attention. I really appreciate it. We'll share the slides, but Paula, I hope that's some helpful sort of context and background for your presentation. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. So yeah, just a quick introduction to myself. So I am Paula Kemp. I'm Head of Stakeholder Engagement at Social Mobility Commission. As Sanjay said previously, I've worked in a role where Dee and I actually in the firm at Santander So I do understand some of the things that I'm going to say now are quite challenging for organisations, and if it was easier, we'd all be doing a lot more of it, I think. But you know, we want people to take on this task and really challenge themselves in terms of thinking about socio-economic diversity in their workplace. So who are the Social Mobility Commission? So we are a arm's length body to government. We're actually sponsored by the Cabinet Office and sit under the Equality Hub within the Cabinet Office. And we have publicly appointed commissioners. So our current chair is Alan Francis, who is a principal of a CEO and principal of a further education college up in Blackpool. And then we have 6 other commissioners from all walks of life who support us in our work to report to the government in terms of social mobility. And we do that through an annual report that looks at social mobility and the UK in our State of the Nation report. And our last one was published last September and due to publish the next one this September. And that really kind of dives into sort of against geography, place-based and people-based social mobility. And off the back of that, the Commission works to look at how can we support government, employers, educationalists, etc., in terms of really thinking about what matters most to support the UK and social mobility. Because, you know, our drive is that we want people to have opportunities that they may not have, you know, their parents may not have had, and to really achieve success. So in terms of what is social mobility and why does it matter, I'm sure you've seen similar slides where people talk about starting points and races in terms of diversity and inclusion. But we know that there are limited jobs and opportunities out there for people, and how far we can move up that escalator partly depends on our efforts, but also on our starting point and our background. And so there's some really key statistics in terms of if you come from a lower socioeconomic background and when you start primary school, you're already a certain amount of months, something like 5 or 6 months behind your peers. By the time you leave secondary school, that gap has widened. And so therefore we do know that there are things to address within the education system, and also in terms of opportunities, and in terms of from an employer perspective, in terms of those opportunities and how do you offer them up to people. So if we remove barriers and open up more opportunities, we can increase absolute mobility. So more people can move up in life, but the starting point still makes a difference. And what we're looking to do, and what our employer resources do, and what I know lots of organisations do, is really thinking about what support can you give to people who are starting further back that then helps them making the opportunity more equal in terms of moving up that escalator. So we, Nick did a great job in terms of talking some of the statistics, and obviously highlighted some of the statistics in terms of other occupations, not just accountancy. So I just wanted to provide a bit more background to some of the research. Most of it is done by the Bridge Group. But what we know is that, you know, once people are in and access jobs, there is still a challenge for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in terms of getting on. So we know in the legal profession, it takes people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds 1.5 years longer to reach partner. And that's when all other data behind them and all other opportunities and their education, etc., is all equal. We know in financial services, it takes people from a lower socioeconomic background 25% longer to progress through the grades. Those in real estate, over half of them in senior positions come from a higher socioeconomic background. And when you think about the national picture that Nick presented, you know, that is over and above the national picture. And in creative industries, some work we did with the Policy and Evidence Centre, they talk about you're twice as likely to land a job in creative occupation to start off with. So over 50% of the workforce in the creative occupation comes from a higher socioeconomic background, and you are more likely then to progress into managerial positions within that industry as well. So it's not unique to the accountancy profession. But what is great is work that is going on in the accountancy profession, which obviously Mark will talk about in a bit, to really understand what the position's like for each individual firm, and also take action to mitigate that, and to really offer opportunities for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's a couple of opportunities that the role of the employer. So employers help determine the social mobility of their workforce, and social mobility outcomes of their workforce. So they set the pay, they set the where you set up in the country. They determine your pension pots, so obviously have implications for later in life as well. They determine who they recruit and who they progress within an organisation. And there's over 30 million people in paid employment within the UK, and therefore to have a real influence on the lives of those individuals. And there's only so much government policy can do to influence employers. Employers are businesses who obviously have, set strategy in terms of running their business, and so the influence that the Social Mobility Commission is looking for is for employers to really kind of consider how you want to make up your workforce and how you want to contribute to UK's civil society, I guess, in terms of supporting social mobility. And you hold a lot of influence, not only within your workforce, but also within your client database, your suppliers. So some work we did with the creative industries, for instance, showcased sort of the payment terms for freelancers was really prohibiting people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to want to work in those roles because of the sort of cash flow problems and not having family money behind them to support them while they start out in their career. So some of the things that as an employer you can look at is really driving the vision of this, putting exactly as Nick said, so putting socioeconomic background into your diversity and inclusion strategy, and to really drive that vision of why it's important. And Nick did a very good job at showing, in terms of how across all of the diversity characteristics, it lays across those characteristics. And then in terms of considering your access pool, so how do you widen the talent pool, especially in early careers? So what sort of pathways into your organisation can you help create a different pathway for those who haven't come through the traditional route, maybe? So things like apprenticeships, T-levels. I know that they're starting T-levels in financial and accountancy. So could you address that? And then really having a culture that supports that diverse and inclusive culture. And then in terms of progression, well, we've talked a bit about how it is incredibly difficult to progress once you're in. And so ensuring that the best can succeed, really. And then the last one is data. And we do share as part of our, we've got a financial and professional services toolkit, the key questions to ask. And as Nick mentioned, it is absolutely that question around parental occupation. And that's because it's been shown to, it's been developed, and it shows that that is the challenge in terms of moving into social mobility outcomes for all. So what can you do, and what can your organisation do? So in terms of the Social Mobility Commission, we did an employer consultation a couple of years back, 18 months back really, and we talked to employers about some of the tools that are suggested for people that work, and where do the challenges lie within their organisation. So I'm just going to talk through a few of those opportunities. So in terms of leadership, it's really important to have the backing of your leadership, and you'll know that anyway. If you're a diversity and inclusion manager, you'll know that that's required in terms of to be fully committed to this agenda. And then have visibility and accessibility. So you really showcase people's backgrounds within your organisation, but also how are they engaging with the younger people. Nick talked a bit about sponsorships, and that comes under part of our progression, but are they engaged in sponsorship programs or mentoring programs? Are they engaged with any outreach programs that you take? And to really commit time and resources to this. In terms of data, it's really important to collect the data of your employees, but that's not the end of it. That's just the start, and it is quite difficult to do, we do realise. But you can then look at the data and see where you've got gaps across your organisation. So you can look at incoming recruitment, you can look at, as Nick mentioned, lateral hires, all across the employee life cycle, even things down to who is getting paid the bonuses, what performance ratings are people getting, are there any discrepancies there that you need to address? And you can then really demonstrate and using the data to demonstrate any change and how that data is influencing the change that you want to see in your organisation. Talked a bit about outreach. So to widen your talent pool, if you can reach students at an early stage, lots of organisation, I'm sure Mark will mention some of the stuff that KPMG do, but reach out to schools that are in what were called social mobility cold spots, but also then kind of supporting those students not only to get into kind of professional careers within accountancy, but other careers as well. A lot of employers see that as a success, even if they don't join your firm. And as an individual, volunteer your time and don't just go into the schools of your children within your organisation. Really try to reach those schools that are harder to reach. And there's some brilliant organisations that work across the UK that help set this up. So people like Speakers for Schools or the Careers and Enterprise Company, who work with schools to deliver programs within those schools, and they really target schools with high incidences of free school meals or pupil premiums. And then in terms of your hiring practices, really think about inclusive hiring processes. And again, this goes back to the leadership, making sure that people don't bypass these as well. That came up in our employer consultation, that a lot of employers do, people in senior leadership try to bypass those practices in terms of recruiting in, and Nick showed the data in terms of what that means for lateral hires in terms of lack of diversity, and really consider the removal of academic requirements. So some organisations have been doing this, and actually it hasn't really impacted, they've been running their own recruitment and assessing on different criteria and assessing for skills, and I've really seen a benefit in terms of that, widening the participation of different groups of people and not your traditional hires, and check bias at interview. On one of our previous employer masterclasses, we talked about accent bias, and there's Accent Britain organisation that looked at accents and people making judgment about accents. And that was quite interesting, just by getting the interview panelists to think about just before they started that it's what the person says and not the way they say it that's the important bit. Really changed the outcomes for some people within that interview process. And then in terms of progression, start having career conversations with people and really understand where they want to go in the organisation and their ambitions. Really think about mentoring and sponsorship programs. Does it reach if it's informal, how do you make sure that it's accessible to more than just the usual suspects, I would say. And also in terms of projects that you deliver, stretch projects. Quite often, Nick talked a bit about this, but quite often managers and leaders look for people in their own image who would deliver it the same way they might deliver it. And therefore, or give it to the people who are putting their hand up for these stretch projects. and certain groups of people might not want to put their hands up and might not have the, feel quite nervous about the failure rate rather than the success rate, and really think about how you do that. And then clear direction on career pathways. So Nick talked about self-selection. So what we have found is a higher incidence of people in operational roles rather than front-facing roles. But it's those front-facing roles that often are the pathway to the C-suite. So how do you make sure that people have a wide variety of roles, and what does that career pathway look like within your own organisation? And then I think one of the key things is be a change agent. Talk about this within your organisation. Come with an open mind. Be really supportive of this agenda, and then really offer solutions. So quite a lot of organisations have their own networks of people who are really interested in this topic. And if that's something you're looking to set up, then really look at kind of the opportunities that you can support with to make change within your organisation. But we do have lots of resources to support organisations. So we have a socioeconomic diversity and inclusion toolkit for employers in financial and professional services, and these were created alongside a number of employers within the sector. So it is absolutely practice that the sector have been doing and have suggested have worked. So there's lots of practical advice in there. We've also got the building blocks if you're just starting out. So how do you start out? What does that look like? If you want to start a conversation around class in the workplace, we have a Let's Talk About Class resource as well. And there's a QR code there as well. So I'm going to hand over to Mark Russell from KPMG, who is going to talk a bit more in practical terms what they've done in their organisation to address socioeconomic inclusion. So Mark.
Amazing. Thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone. So I'm Mark Russell. I'm a manager in the Inclusion, Diversity and Equity team at KPMG in the UK. I've been part of the team for around 7 years now, and I've had the privilege of leading on our work looking at the social mobility of our own workforce for the last sort of 3 years or so. Now, sure, there'll be many of you on different stages of your journey looking into social mobility, but what I would say is that you've been very lucky today to hear from two incredible experts in Nick and Paula, and actually in the UK, and I have lots of conversations as well with global peers of mine that are kind of always interested in hearing what that we're doing in the UK on social mobility, because it always seems in terms of the sort of landscape and the policy landscape that sort of sits around that in the UK, we are well ahead, and the guidance that is out there and the data to build those case studies is there because of the great work of the likes of Nick and Paula at the Bridge Group and the Social Mobility Commission. So all of the resources and guidance that they've linked to, I would highly recommend that people do take the opportunity to look at that, because again, if you are starting out and you want the kind of the blueprint, a lot of it is there. But I'll talk briefly a little bit about KPMG's journey, conscious of the time as well, but I'll try and sort of do a bit of a whistle stop. But I guess from a KPMG perspective, I guess we started with a commitment, and when we look back at like when we had a sort of a focus on social mobility, it's actually goes way beyond kind of us looking at it from just a workforce and a sort of a socioeconomic diversity issue. And I guess that goes back to us as a company wanting to be a good corporate citizen, focusing on social mobility within the communities and within our supply chain. We were a founding member of the Living Wage Foundation and have been part of the Real Living Wage movement for nearly 20 years now. And I guess that was one of the sort of initiatives that really kind of drove some of our other sort of work, focusing on social mobility then within our corporate responsibility space as well, and then how we work with charities, and again then looking at our recruitment teams, and certainly in our student recruitment teams, looking at how we work with schools and educational institutions that are kind of more focused in areas of greater socioeconomic disadvantage, and as Paula touched on earlier, that's kind of evolved over time, and we certainly focus areas that are in social mobility cold spots to ensure that we're kind of trying to open up the participation and access to opportunity within KPMG to a greater number of young people in the UK. So I guess we can almost split what we done in terms of a lot of our work from like pre-2016 and then post-2016 to when we realised that actually, if we're looking at what we're doing around social mobility sort of externally outside of KPMG, what's it look like internally? What's the socioeconomic diversity of our workforce look like? And actually at that time in 2016, there was a team that was kind of created within our corporate affairs function to kind of look at social mobility as a policy issue, really, to understand, but what are we not doing that we need to start doing to really start understanding our socioeconomic diversity within the workforce. And actually, again, a lot of that work between 2016 and 2018 was very collaborative. It was working with organisations like the Social Mobility Commission, like the Bridge Group, doing lots of data. And again, it was looking at the guidance, and it was the start point for our data collection journey, really, because at that point we were like, right, what do we need to start doing? We need to start collecting the data here. We need to build that data set so that we can kind of understand what it is we need to measure and improve. And also that period then between 2016 and 2018, the other thing that I think a lot of that initial sort of policy work found was exactly what Nick was talking about earlier, and Paula touched upon it. It was, if we want socioeconomic diversity to get the same standing as other aspects of our inclusion, diversity and equity work, we needed to embed it as part of that. So 2018 was actually a bit of a game changer, because that was when socioeconomic diversity was kind of embedded into our broader inclusion, diversity and equity work. And we've got kind of 6 key characteristics, I guess, that we focus on at KPMG, which is gender, ethnicity, Black heritage, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic background now. So those 6 characteristics. And what happened in 2018 was, again, it just gave socioeconomic background that same standing as those other characteristics. And then over time, we now kind of report and set targets around representation in exactly the same way on socioeconomic background as we do across all of those other 5 characteristic areas as well. So if you go on our external impact website, you'll see we have a socioeconomic background target in the same way that we have a gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation target, and we also then publish our pay gaps as well. So we've kind of brought in that sort of equitable, I guess, equitable implementation of how we report progress and publish all of the sort of the targets and progress we're making on those, which for me was kind of when we look back was quite a big step. And actually, if you want, I guess, to put socioeconomic diversity on that standing, I think it is important that it gets embedded into the broader inclusion, diversity and equity landscape. And as Nick said, there's a lot of elements that again will underline other parts of inclusion, diversity and equity, and obviously there's a huge impact around the sort of intersectional elements of those as well. So along that journey, I guess we had lots of firsts. We were the first UK firm to publish a target. So in September 2021, when we were also the first UK firm to publish their socioeconomic background pay gap, we also set a representation target for 29% of our partners to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And we set it at partner level because we wanted to make it quite clear that actually it's not just about recruitment into the organisation, it's also about how people then get on and progress and thrive within the organisation as well. So that target, when we set that target, we were around 21% of partners in the firm that were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We're now at 24%, and I guess we know kind of that progress will not always be linear year on year, but we set those targets out to 2030, so a bit longer term, so that we ultimately know that whilst it might not always be linear, we've got those targets to aim for, and across the business, we're now able to embed socioeconomic diversity as a key kind of component of all of the work that we do on inclusion, diversity and equity. And just as what Paula was touching on around the data, it means that we get to do some really interesting and cool things with the data. We can make sure that we are looking at socioeconomic background in the same way as we are around all of those other 5 areas as well. And whilst it's not a particularly kind of like sexy aspect of the work that we do, being able to look at things like performance, pay, progression through those lenses is incredibly insightful, and it means that we can then look at the action plans that we've got in place, any of the initiatives, and make sure that we're targeting them in the right way and taking positive action really to kind of move the dial. I'm just going to touch on, I know probably nearly at time, and I know we want some time for Q&A, but just going to touch on some of the progression research that also we worked on with Nick and published at the end of 2022. And it was a bit of a groundbreaking study because it looked at the impact of all of those 6 characteristics that I mentioned earlier as well. And also we were able to look at it through intersectional lenses as well. But what I guess it told us was socioeconomic background was still the biggest barrier to career progression at KPMG. And we looked at that. It was a 5-year study that we looked at it. We looked at the data back in 2017 and then again in 2022. And all of the other characteristics, actually, there'd been an equalization of the progression gaps over that time period. And although the progression gap for socioeconomic background had reduced by 3 percentage points from the 22% gap to 19% gap, it was still by far the biggest gap. So it was still the biggest barrier to career progression. And interestingly, when we then did look at it through intersectional lenses, when we layered that with gender and ethnicity, for example, there was again additional compounded progression barriers. So I think the research showed that Black women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and white women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds faced the biggest progression gaps when analysed across all of the sort of intersections that we looked across. I'm gonna stop there because I know we're probably at time, and we want some time for Q&A. So I'm gonna hand back over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all our speakers. I'm sure you'll all agree. I mean, we're very, just to echo Mark's point there, we're very lucky to have the expertise around the table today. But believe it or not, that has been an hour. So I think what we're going to do is just spend a very sharp, fast minute to do one quick question, almost a quick fire question, and any other questions that have been posted, we will put up online, or you can ask them to events@icas.com. So just for anybody here on the panel at the moment, but we've heard a lot about the specifics, some great technical data, some good anecdotal evidence. Before employers can take action to improve social mobility, what problem do you think they need to define themselves and that they need to understand that needs to be addressed before they go on that journey? And if we could just keep it really concise, and if anyone, it's got a very fast couple of word answer, that'd be great. Shall we start with you, Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. I think the starting point often is collecting the data for two reasons. I think that helps us understand what's going on in the workplace, but because this, as you said, Clive, is a much less visible diversity characteristic, in asking people for this data, you also encourage discussions around it. But I would also say that the data is necessary but not sufficient.
Thank you, Nick. Paula?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nick, and I often say to people, it's not just when you're collecting the data, it's not just a data campaign, it's a comms campaign. So really need to think about communicating around it. So that's a real challenge. But I would also say is quite often we meet organisations where they say we don't have a problem. And I think look at all the data that's out there already and all the reports that show in this industry and others, there is an issue. So why do you think your organisation's any different? So if you haven't yet collected the data, why do you think your other organisation's any different? And it just highlights. I think if you're not facing barriers yourself, you often think there aren't barriers in your own workplace. And especially if you come from a higher socioeconomic background in a leadership position, you're not going to realise some of the challenges other people are facing.
Thank you, Paula. And then Mark, just to round that off, anything to add?
Transparency and visibility. Really good point from Paula. I think at KPMG, whilst it feels like we might have done a lot, we are always very open to say we've still got a huge way to go and there's so much we still need to and want to do. But I think being transparent about that and then giving people the visibility, because sometimes people's stories are slightly separate from just the data collection piece, which is obviously important, but giving people that space, safety, and permission really to then kind of talk about a topic that, as you were saying, is sometimes not always visible. It can be really powerful.
You, Mark, agree, absolutely agree. And Clive, just to give you the last word.
Thanks, Sanjay. I was just going to say that, on Saturday we had our annual admission ceremony for all those students becoming newly qualified CAs. And talking to some of the foundation students who have come clearly from a socioeconomic background, lower socioeconomic background, I have to say they are some of our most driven students, and I suspect will probably be some of our most loyal CA members going forward. So I think that really enforces the sort of the business case, if you like, for organizations to support such initiatives. Thanks, Sanjay.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you. So as we wrap up, just a few things to close off with. One is there'll be a poll coming up on your screen, so please do participate in the poll to let us know what you think of this webinar. And I personally just want to express my deepest gratitude to our distinguished panel of speakers, Clive, Paula, Nick and Mark, for sharing their valuable insights and expertise with us today. I think everybody would agree with me when I say your perspectives have enriched our understanding of social mobility for both employers and in the accountancy profession, and certainly has inspired me to continue striving for positive change. I also want to extend my thanks to you all, our audience, for your interest, thoughtful questions, and commitment to advancing diversity and inclusion within the accountancy field. And just to remember that the journey towards greater social mobility and inclusivity is ongoing. So let's carry forward the momentum from today's discussion and continue working together to create a more equitable and diverse accountancy profession. If you're interested in other ICAS webinars coming up, you'll see those on the events page, so please take a look. There's a great one in May on women's wealth, then meet the new ICAS president later in May, and again in June, an event at the Aberdeen Art Gallery. So please take a look at the ICAS events. So with that, I'd like to bring our webinar to a close. On behalf of ICAS, the ICAS Foundation and our entire team, thank you once again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our future events. Goodbye and take care.